Hello and welcome everyone. My name is David Livy. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Manager here at SCVO. Thank you all for coming along to our webinar on the Scottish Budget today, which we hope there'll be some good discussion about what the implications are for the voluntary sector here in Scotland. Everyone here today will know just how much our essential sector does. We're a significant economic actor. We deliver vital public services to people and communities across the country. So the Scottish Government's budget is dead important. It's crucial to know what it means for our voluntary sector. And this year, there have been lots of moving parts, in particular, national insurance and the implications flowing from the Chancellor's announcement in the UK budget. But I'm pleased to say we have three fantastic speakers here today, covering all things budget and giving us an idea of what's going on. So we'll get an understanding of what the budget means for the sector, the voluntary sector, the public sector, and for Scotland as a whole. So we are really lucky to be joined by Mary Spowage, Professor of Practice at the University of Strathclyde and Director of the Fraser Rallender Institute. Mary will be telling us about the impact of the budget and the wider economic picture here in Scotland and what it might mean for voluntary organisations. We'll also have SCVO's very own Shelley Ogilvie taking on how the budget impacts voluntary organisations, and she'll talk a wee bit about what we've been doing here at SCVO on all things budget. And we're also delighted to have Mirren Kelly, Chief Officer covering local government finance at COSLA. So Mirren will be looking at how budget impacts local government and how this might affect voluntary organisations across the country. After our speakers have each said their piece, about 10 to 15 minutes each, we'll have about 40 minutes or so for Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat throughout, along with who you are, your organisation, and who your question is directed towards, and I'll pick those up at the end and put them to our fantastic panelists. So without further ado, I'll stop talking. You're not here to listen to me, and I'll hand over to our first speaker today, Mary Spowage.
Thanks, David, and thanks for inviting me back to talk at the SCVO webinar this year. It feels like a long time since the Scottish budget, to be honest, David. But we all have been talking about national insurance, as you were saying to me just before we started, for months now, since the end of October. Many people weren't surprised that the Chancellor chose to increase employers' national insurance, but I think the level of the threshold reduction was something that took a lot of people off guard, and is particularly going to impact on organisations in the voluntary sector, or those who are quite low margin businesses with a lot of staff. It is hard to talk about the Scottish budget without thinking about the UK budget that preceded it, which very much sort of set the envelope for what the Finance Secretary was dealing with in December. We said at the time at the FAI that it's likely that the UK budget made things considerably easier for Shona Robeson than she might have thought, particularly given the uplift in spending that was announced for the 25-26 financial year, so the year that this budget refers to. Both governments in the rhetoric about the budgets have said that they see, growth as a key goal. And in part, that's because they see it as a way to get out of the pretty bad fiscal conditions we're in terms of the amount of money that's around to spend and the state that public services are in, and the amount of investment that they require to get back on a more normal footing in the face of, ever increasing demand for public services due to various factors. So that's the rhetoric about the budget. But if you look at the analysis that accompanied the UK budget from the Office for Budget Responsibility, it's clear that the measures that were taken in the UK budget have impacted upon growth. According to them, they have lowered growth, they've lowered investment, and they'll lower wages over the 5-year forecast period. From next year to sort of almost pretty much 2030. And then mainly that's driven by the decision on employer next. The extra spending that the tax rises that were announced in the budget have partly funded, although they were also funded by an increase in borrowing, which was made possible by her changing the fiscal rules, the Chancellor. This spend in 2025 does boost growth in 2025, but it very much lowers growth for the other years of the forecast horizon. What happens after 25-26? And I think all of us perhaps will be wondering that as we move into the spring and look forward to the spending review, which we'll come back to. In general, when we talk to businesses and you see business surveys since the budget, businesses are pretty gloomy. And particularly those who are perhaps smaller organisations, or those who, like a lot of voluntary sector organisations, might have a lot of staff and be low margin, are feeling pretty gloomy about prospects as we move into 2025, which is perhaps not what the Chancellor was hoping for. And particularly given the issues in the bond markets and other things which have made her fiscal position more precarious. It's definitely not the new year that perhaps the UK Labour government were hoping for, which is impacting, of course, on how people feel about the government at Westminster. But I'm supposed to be talking about the Scottish budget, so let me move on to that. It was a very political budget, definitely with an eye on May 2026. The headline grabbing announcement was the decision to mitigate the two-child benefit cap from 2026-27. Of course, that is from 2026-27, not from next year, the budget year that was actually in question, although a small amount of money has been allocated in 25-26 to look at setting up the administration that will be necessary to make it happen. There's an interesting phenomenon that's happened with this, though, that it wasn't costed by the Scottish Fiscal Commission in advance of the budget. So to some extent, it seems like it was a last-minute decision to announce this. There's a lot of discussion by the First Minister in the last few weeks about them trying to do it earlier if possible. Again, there's no money in the budget for this for 25-26. So where that money is going to come from if they decide to do that is not clear. I mean, in general, the amount of money that the Scottish Government had because of the decisions of the UK Government's budget meant that settlements for many areas were probably better than some had feared. And Mirren will no doubt cover what the local government think of the settlement. And also, they announced a public sector pay deal over 3 years of 9% as part of the budget. We've highlighted some issues, perhaps, with some of the announcements in the budget. Particularly, there's no provision for the compensation for employer national insurance contributions being less than it's going to cost, which is a likely outcome. So there's quite a lot of movable parts still to happen before the end of the financial year for us to really understand what the consequences will be for 2025-26. And we're slightly worried that the government haven't learned lessons of previous years in order to avoid emergency fiscal events halfway through the year, as we've had for the last 3 financial years, and just makes things difficult for everyone and less predictable. And I'm sure many of you have suffered as a result of the cutbacks that happened in the autumn, for example, and the consequences of that. So as we move into the new year, it's slightly different to what I was imagining. I was imagining lots of excitement at different stages of the budget when people are horse trading around trying to get votes to pass the budget. But Labour announcing that they'll abstain on the budget sort of put paid to that, which means that the budget is going to pass. But there's lots of fiscal fun to be had in the first half of this year, don't worry. We're looking forward to getting supplementary estimates, as boring as that sounds, from the Treasury. What that will mean is that they'll be confirming how much compensation is going to the Scottish Government to compensate them for the employer NICS rises, and to what extent the government are going to have to find money from elsewhere in the budget to be able to cover that these sorts of changes. In March, we'll get an update to the UK level forecasts. It's not supposed to be a policy event. The Chancellor isn't supposed to make announcements about spending, tax, or borrowing. But what if, given the deterioration in the financial markets, she breaks her fiscal rules? Will anything change? Will spending change? And what implications could that have for Scotland? In May, we will get the medium-term financial strategy from the Scottish Government, which should be their 5-year plans. So that should be the end of May. They have said, informally to me, that this is still going ahead, despite the fact the spending review is not coming till June. I really hope that does come to give us more of an idea of their view on their spending plans over the course of the next 5 years and the pressures that is on their budget. And then, as I've already mentioned, in June, we'll get the spending review with 3-year plans. At the moment, after the 25-26 year, spending plans look very tight. I think everyone will welcome a return to multi-year budgeting, and we would expect that would therefore allow the Scottish Government to give local government and other parts of the public sector more certainty, which will allow them to give organisations like yourselves who provide services more certainty over a multi-year period, which I think we would all welcome, and we've not had that sort of normality for many, many years. But the overall fiscal envelope looks very tight if the Chancellor is going to stick to the fiscal rules. So it might be certainty, but it might be certainty about the position being pretty tough for the next few years. On that cheery note, David, I'll come back to you.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thanks for ending on that cheery note as well. Amazing detail and insight as always. Before I pass over to Shelley, just a reminder that if you have questions throughout, if you get questions for anything Mary was just talking about, please put them in the chat along with who you are, your organisation, and who your question is for. So I'll now pass to Shelley Ogilvie to hear about the direct impact of the budget on voluntary organisations and to outline some of the work we've been doing here at SCVO on the UK budget and the Scottish budget as well. Shelley.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to start with the reminder it's unlikely anyone here needs. Scotland's voluntary sector is under pressure, costs are climbing, funding is falling, and demand for services continues to increase. As a result, 8 out of 10 organisations report that financial difficulties rank among their most significant challenges. Our sector needed recognition, resources and support in the Scottish budget, and today I will offer an overview of some of the actions the Scottish Government could have taken. But I'm going to start with a bit of a disclaimer, as I always do. In my experience, it's really difficult to truly understand the impact of the Scottish budget on the voluntary sector. As we all know, the voluntary sector is hugely diverse, and organisations receive funding from many different Scottish Government departments. How funding flows to the sector from departments is not broken down, and as a result, an overall picture of what the budget invests in the sector and if this investment increases or decreases year on year is not available. This picture is further complicated as well. Some voluntary organisations are funded through government. Funding is also received from third parties such as funders or other public bodies and local government, as Miriam will discuss shortly. SCVO continue to call for action to be taken on funding transparency to enable us to better understand funding flows to the voluntary sector and to other sectors. And I think it's worth mentioning that Scottish Government have ongoing strands of work through which action is being taken on funding transparency, but it's a slow process and possibly also a process that highlights how much work does need to be done because it's a lot. One area that always attracts a lot of attention within the budget is the third sector budget line, partly because of the transparency issue. The third sector budget line is one of the few areas in the Scottish budget where it's possible to clearly see increases and decreases year on year, so it offers comparable figures. However, this budget line is just a small part of the Scottish Government's overall investment in the sector. It funds, for example, SCVO, and other voluntary sector infrastructure organisations and projects. And this year, the third sector budget line remained largely the same as last year at 14.1 million. So it did fall slightly from 14.7 million last year, partly because social enterprise moved from the third sector unit to the Wellbeing Economy division, and because of the end of the Community Capacity and Resilience Fund. As the third sector budget line is one of the few lines in the budget which only funds the sector, a standstill budget is a disappointment. Despite rising costs, there's no suggestion within the budget that the Scottish Government have budgeted for uplifts in grant funding and contracts. There were, however, a couple of specific commitments relating to the living wage within the budget. There was 21 million to ensure the real living wage for early learning and childcare and children's social care staff in private and third sector commissioned services. And there was 125 million to ensure adult social care staff in private and third sector commissioned services are paid the real living wage, so both by April 2025. SCVO have called for uplifts as part of our fair funding work for many years, and as supporters of fair work, we welcome these living wage commitments. But there is a need to go further to ensure grants and contracts cover the full cost of employing staff, including at least the real living wage, any increased NICS costs, and inflation-based uplifts on par with those offered to public sector staff. So as we all know, standstill budgets, they're not sustainable for voluntary organisations, for our staff, our volunteers, or for the communities that we work with. And that really leads us to SCVO's main ask, which is fair funding. So SCVO have been focused on fair funding for many years, and many of you will be familiar with this work. In short, fair funding is a long-term, flexible, sustainable and accessible approach to voluntary sector funding. And for over a decade, the Scottish Government have recognised that adopting multi-year spending plans supports financial planning and the sustainability of the voluntary sector. Multi-year funding is, however, just one element of fair funding, and SCVO stressed for many years that multi-year funding that does not incorporate the other fair funding elements, such as flexible and restricted core funding, timely payments, more accessible application processes, transparent approaches to monitoring and reporting, and inflation-based uplifts. So all of those things are needed, or ultimately funding undermines the sustainability of the voluntary sector. And since April 2023, the Scottish Government have committed to achieving fairer funding by 2026, which SCVO and colleagues across the sector have welcomed. But do notice the difference there: fairer funding, not fair funding. So it's not quite the same as what we've called for. Beyond multi-year funding and ensuring timely notification of funding, what else the Scottish Government's commitment to fairer funding includes is unclear, and progress has been slow, and as we all know, 2026 is fast approaching. Within our budget and broader work, SCVO encouraged the Scottish Government to make progress by aligning their fairer funding principles with SCVO's definition of fair funding, which was developed through significant research and engagement with Scotland's voluntary sector. And to make progress, we've stressed the need for transparent delivery goals, timelines, and accountability mechanisms, such as reporting in stakeholder groups, to ensure progress on fairer funding can be scrutinised by the voluntary sector and Parliament. So that's something that we don't really have at the moment, and it's difficult for us to scrutinise the progress. Within the budget, there was little action, and only a commitment that the Scottish Government, and a quote here, will continue to work closely with key infrastructure partners in the third sector on their commitment to fairer funding. So that's all there was within the budget. I think this is really disappointing this year, as the Scottish Government need to take action to achieve their 2026 commitment, and because of the huge amount of work on voluntary sector funding this year. So many people at the webinar today will have been involved in the Social Justice and Social Security Committee pre-budget scrutiny work on third sector funding. And the committee heard from organisations across the sector, intermediaries, funders, and all of these witnesses offered examples of good and bad practice. And the committee's recommendations overlap considerably with SCVO's fair funding work, recognising the need for progress to ensure organisations can maintain their service levels and meet wage commitments without having to cut back on essential services or depleting reserves. So it would have been great to see more about that in the budget, but obviously there was just the one line. But there is some advantages still of the work. So one advantage of the work is that the Scottish Government needed to respond to the committee. And the committee received a response from the Scottish Government to its pre-budget report in December. And on the 9th of January, Shirley-Ann Somerville, the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and Social Security, gave evidence to the committee. And in that evidence, she recognised the financial pressures on the third sector. She said that the 2024 programme for government committed the Scottish Government to make improvements in grant making. She acknowledged that it's difficult to understand funding flows to the sector from different departments, and she said that the new financial management system will enable an understanding of baseline grant information across government, so very much look forward to that. She shared that government would increase the number of two-year funding agreements with third sector organisations, and they were developing a pilot within government to support organisations that either deliver essential services or contribute to the government's priority of ending child poverty. And she said that the government were also working to ensure that they deliver earlier grant notification overall. So quite a few commitments there she made on the 9th. So in many ways, the current position feels similar to last year, where there was a lot of positive rhetoric about voluntary sector funding. There was agreement about the need to improve, but there wasn't enough action. Last year, there was also the commitment to timely payments, and the Cabinet Secretary stated that over half of voluntary sector organisations were notified of their funding by March 2024, including 87% from her department. And that provides a baseline upon which to measure progress this year. So it's good to have those figures and to have the commitment again this year to see what progress has been made. In 2025-26, Scottish Government planned to have funding confirmation as soon as possible after the budget statement. And at SVO, we did hear from some organisations that literally the day after the statement, they started to get notifications about their funding. So that is good for the organisations who received that. And those were particularly, again, from the social justice portfolio, but often they weren't with uplifts. So while there were a confirmation of their funding, there was no uplift within them. So it's good to see some progress, but of course there'll still be many organisations that don't have any confirmation, but should have that by the end of March, according to the Scottish Government's commitments. So slightly out with the scope of this webinar, in 2024-25, there was also a commitment from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Shona Robison, to revisiting a multi-year funding plan in the medium-term financial strategy. And as we've just heard from Mary, that will take place at the end of May. So we look forward to seeing more in that about how the Scottish Government is going to achieve multi-year funding, beyond this pilot that they've discussed at the minute. And of course, as Mary's already mentioned, the Scottish Government haven't been the only government with a budget recently. And I'm also going to mention increases to national insurance contributions by the UK Chancellor and the impact of these increases on voluntary organisations in Scotland, but I will keep it brief. The voluntary sector in the UK employs over 1 million people, including 136,000 people in Scotland, and that's 5% of Scotland's workforce, which often isn't appreciated. As a significant employer, increases to employer national insurance contributions set to go ahead in April will have a significant impact on medium and large voluntary sector employers. So not everybody. And SCVO shared with the UK Chancellor some of our concerns ahead of the budget when there started to be rumours that this was one of the changes that was going to take place. So we estimate that these changes will cost voluntary sector employers in Scotland over 75 million per year, plus inflation, and some organisations will face additional costs of hundreds of thousands of pounds. And of course, as we all know, that puts essential services, jobs, and organisations themselves at risk. Despite this, the UK Chancellor has confirmed her intention to limit relief for these increases to the public sector and government departments. The UK government offered Scotland an additional 300 million to meet the additional costs. So that's in addition to the Barnett consequentials in the UK budget. But as is often the case, the Scottish government contest this amount. And they estimate that the actual cost is in the region of 750 million. And it is worth noting that there's a larger, and from my understanding, better paid public sector in Scotland. So there's going to be some differences there. So what have the Scottish Government said about these increases, both during and since the Scottish budget? In the Scottish budget, the Scottish Government recognised the additional pressures for the public sector, businesses and the third sector, and they committed to continue to press HM Treasury to fully fund this cost. And they also said that they'll take decisions on the allocations of any consequentials when they receive confirmation from HM Treasury. So basically at the moment, we don't really know what's happening. At the start of this month, First Minister John Swinney and President of the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, Shona Morrison, similar names there, called on the Chancellor to cover the additional costs and to ensure that this is extended to the full range of organisations, but no, delivering public services. So not everybody. 48 organisations from across Scottish civil society joined the call, including SCVO. So we welcome recognition from the First Minister and MSPs across the Scottish Parliament that the Chancellor's intention to increase employers' national insurance contributions will have a significant impact on the voluntary sector in Scotland, and we do welcome the First Minister's call for support for the sector. But despite that, we'll still encourage the UK Chancellor to change course. However, if the Chancellor can't be convinced to change course, and that seems increasingly likely because there has been a lot of pressure on the Chancellor, but she hasn't changed her mind. And there is currently a bill going through the House of Lords, so we'll brief for that this week. But if she doesn't change her mind, which doesn't seem like she's going to, the Scottish Government must ensure that their financial commitments to voluntary organisations cover these additional costs and that other public bodies have the funds to do the same. Ultimately, Scottish Government must ensure grants and contracts Scottish Government, their agencies and other public bodies award support fair work and cover the full costs of employing staff, including at least the real living wage, any increased national insurance costs and inflation-based uplifts on par with those offered to public sector staff. And while Mirren will cover local authorities in a moment, it's also worth noting that until local authorities have their own national insurance contributions sorted out, there's also a potential hole in their budgets, and that could potentially impact and delay funding from local authorities to the sector. So to conclude, SCVO will continue to call for and monitor progress towards fair funding, and that's our priority for the year ahead. We'll continue to emphasise how central our essential sector is to achieving the Scottish Government's ambitions and that the current funding environment is unsustainable, as we have done for many years. And we'll have some engagement work coming up over the next few months on timely payments, on fair funding more broadly, and for our Scottish Manifesto work. And we very much hope that you might be interested in contributing to that work and sharing our messaging on the need for fair funding for the voluntary sector. So if you're interested in getting involved, just get in touch. But before I finish, I just wanted to highlight that amongst what I've spoken about, there are some successes, because it might feel like that there's not. Progress has been slow, but that the Social Justice and Social Security Committee chose to focus their 2025 budget scrutiny work on third sector funding principles, that is a win, and it does highlight cross-party support for many fair funding elements, and it provides a lot of evidence of the benefits of fair funding. So we should all utilise that. Similarly, that the First Minister, who is new to his role, included fairer funding in the budget and continues to support that is positive. Even though it didn't specifically say by 2026 in there, but he is still committed to that. And I think we need to take those positives with us for the year ahead and push for action by 2026, which was the Scottish Government's commitment, and within political party manifesto, they're all planning their manifestos just now, and we'll want to push for some action within those. And with that, I'll pass back to David.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for that comprehensive insight into the issues that are facing the voluntary organisation and how voluntary organisations and how that factors in the budget itself, and also a great overview of the work being done here at SCVO by our wonderful colleagues. We'll now hear from Mirren at COSLA with a local government perspective on the impact of the budget, along with what this might mean for the voluntary sector. Before pass over to Mirren, please, we've got questions coming in, but please do not be shy at putting your questions in the chat or the Q&A function. I'll keep an eye on both. And I'll be able to put those to the speakers at the end, just with your name, your organisation, and who the question's for. Okay, without further ado, I'll pass over to Mirren. Mirren.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And again, thanks for inviting us back. Once again, it's not all sunshine and good news from the local government perspective. The way that I've sort of been describing this is that this is a better budget than previous years, but that doesn't mean it's a good budget. If you look at only the headline figures of the increases to local government funding, it can look like a huge amount of money has come in, over £1 billion. The issue about that is, as ever, a lot of that funding was already committed in 24-25 or was already expected for 25-26 for some of the commitments, things like the funding to support the real living wage and adult social care, etc. So I'll pick some of that up. So in terms of the detail then of what local government is left with that is actually sort of additional uncommitted resource, that's £289 million in revenue. And if you take into account the restoration of the cut within the core capital grant during 24-25, it's only 11 million in the capital space. So that's like a huge challenge and pressure. And while there's an additional one-off capital funding of 40 million for the climate emergency, again, that's one-off, and 40 million in the context of the entire climate emergency is not a substantive sum, as we'd say. A couple of things to highlight to kind of put that 289 million pounds in context, because that sounds like quite a lot. But if you think of it sort of across Scottish local government nationally, it's not that much when you get down to it. So for context, a 1% pay rise for our direct staff is 125 million pounds. So even within the context of the public sector pay bill, which obviously it ends up providing a benchmark for the negotiations with unions. So if you look at the 3% assumption that kind of starts things off at, that's 375 million right there. So already savings are needed to make kind of a potential pay award if that's sort of the space it's in, and even more so if it's higher. I wouldn't be able to do this myself without mentioning the employers' national insurance contributions, and I can confirm that this is it is such a big concern to everyone. We are really concerned about the impact both directly for local government and indirectly for third sector and other commission services because of the impact here. So you will have hopefully seen some of the press that we sort of put out immediately after the announcement, and other elements that have featured subsequently. So the estimate for the direct cost to local government just for their staff is 265 million. And in terms of the wider impact then on commission services, it's challenging to get to a total commission service figure, but I continue to work on it. One of the ones I am confident in is that the adult social care commission services, so that's third and private sector, comes to about 85 million. So even from that, you can kind of see the scale of the pressure. Within sort of what we know around that is that the indications have been from UK government in terms of, I think it was possibly a leaked document at some point that indicated the potential of around 300 million, as Shelley kind of referenced before. That's not confirmed. That's not coming through. That's what Barry was saying. will appear during the supplementary estimates when they emerge, but that is completely insufficient for Scottish public sector. The reason why there's going to be this disparity is because of the way UK government are choosing to fund this. They are doing it by providing additional funding to the UK government departments, which then generates consequentials, which are then sort of passed on. So there's still some unknowns in terms of exactly which elements of their own pay bill they deem are in scope for this compensation, which might not be how everyone defines or assumes the whole public sector looks like. And then there is also the fact that, as was stated earlier, Scottish public sector whole is bigger than the relative public sector in the UK, and generally better paid than the relative public sector in the UK, as you can see from recent decisions that Scottish Government made about pay awards to NHS staff, to teachers, and within some local government as well, and other parts of it. So in terms of how local authorities are having to kind of deal with that, is that we're not in a position to be able to kind of assume that will be fully funded even for our direct staff, let alone the impact it will then have within kind of the cost of commissioned services. So that's having to play out within the budgets that are all being drafted at present. And I guess I think in that bit, it's very much recognised that when it comes to the commission services that many of you provide, that's going to have an impact on kind of on rates in some way. Maybe there are some organisations that have the ability to absorb an element of that increase in cost, but certainly not all of them. And obviously, national insurance payments are not optional ones for any of us, so will have to feature. The reality is then, if there's not additional funding coming through, and that 289 million can't cover pay awards and ENIC gaps and demand and all of this, the reality is that decisions have to be made about what isn't done. And again, if that means less services are commissioned, or increases in fees and charges elsewhere, or all of that has to be considered and balanced in the mix. So still not a brilliantly rosy picture. And I guess there are other constraints within that local authorities have to consider when setting their budgets and the priorities, which continue to be one of the biggest single ones is the desire from Scottish Government to maintain teacher numbers. The pay bill for teachers in Scotland for local government, £3.5 billion. So it's an enormous part of our budget that is all around that. And if that has to be maintained, and the additional pay cost and the additional national insurance cost considered within that space, it pushes greater cuts and more difficult decisions kind of to rest of public local government services. The other area that I get, and there's lots and lots of other like statutory duties that we have to continue to deliver, the 1140 hours for ELC, which does mean, unfortunately, it's anything that is sort of non-statutory or discretionary, which are often some of the really critical preventative elements, often ones that the third sector are really key partners in. Those are the areas where, unfortunately, a lot of the pain ends up getting borne. I wanted to recognise as well that the challenges within the social care space, obviously significant demand and complexity, pressures and changes, and I know that's something that's of concern to us and of concern to yourselves as well. And kind of on that, within the budget, while there's the £289 million for local government, that then has to do everything. So that's there's no separate additional money for social care, apart from the 125 million to support the real living wage. That's it in terms of sort of identified spend for that, so that the 289 million has to be considered in the context of covering every single local government service, which includes social care, which just adds to the pressure there. I could go on for quite a lot, but it's probably not a brilliant use of everyone else's time. I would sort of say that there are other elements that come into play at a more local level in terms of how good or bad it looks locally. Some of which are driven by the distribution process that we go through, which is based on a lot of population data, etc., etc. Obviously, the census was published, and that data is now being brought through kind of into the distribution calculations, which means that if there's been anywhere where there are the estimates previously have sort of drifted away, been somewhat inaccurate, some areas might feel bigger changes than might have been expected. We do have mechanisms in place to kind of dampen the impact and protect local authorities from volatility in that sense, but that will be a factor that plays out. And an enormous amount of the distribution to local government is driven by population, and specifically child population. So that's one of those. But I think I'll probably pause there and just take questions, because I'm at risk of talking about things that people are either not of interest or too much detail.
No, thank you so much, Mirren. It's tremendously useful to get that overview of the local authority considerations. We've got about half an hour by the looks of things, which will give us a chance to put some of the questions that have come in to the panel. Just a reminder, I'm pretty sure more will come in as we're chatting, but yeah, you can just stick them in the Q&A or the chat function. I'm going to take a couple of the questions together and just put them to the panel as a whole. So Martin and Includum has asked if anyone is aware of any work by either government, and we can include local authorities in that as well, so Scottish, UK and local authorities, on the impact of budgets that they have on the sector, and any discussions prior to the budgets. Martin, I'll just say a wee piece here that at SAVO we try very hard to engage all governments to make sure that is understood, but in our experience it's unfortunately the understanding is partial. Parts of a government might understand the impact on voluntary organisations, but other parts might not. So for example, the UK government level, DCMS, who are leading their work on the covenant that they have down the road, may talk a good game about voluntary organisations and their role, but obviously that didn't trickle through to the Treasury, who dropped a bombshell on the sector with the national insurance increases, despite SAVO writing to the Chancellor before the budget was set saying, this has been trailed, going to know. So it's partial in our experience, but I'll take Martin's question on the awareness of the impact of budget setting on the sector, along with a question that's come in specifically from Mary, from Kirsten here at SCVO. Hi, Kirsten. About the budget and the economy across Scotland. So how, in your experiences, how does the voluntary sector come up? Do decision makers understand the cliff edge that some organisations in the sector are facing? So I'll put that to all three panelists, and I'll bring Mary in first, if that's all right.
Sure. Well, to answer Kirsten's question directly, probably not enough, although it comes up when I'm speaking to people because I bring it up. But I do lots of talks to lots of businesses in lots of different sectors and lots of different forums. And as much as, of course, particular types of businesses are very badly affected by the employer NICs rise, particularly those who are people heavy, and tend to employ lots of people, at the lower end of the wage distribution, such as hospitality. I do point out that, if you're say a third sector social care provider or some other essential service like that, you don't have any prices you can adjust. Now, they might be making very difficult decisions about the extent to which they can adjust their prices and still have customers come into their establishments. But, there is just no choice for voluntary sector providers to do that. And so very, very difficult decisions then have to be made about things like staffing levels, if that's even possible, or perhaps just closing altogether. So I do bring it up as much as I can, but I agree that it's not necessarily considered. And, it's not necessarily the case that the government, whichever government you're talking about, would listen to this sector as much as they might listen to the business sector. But then they didn't listen to the business sector either, because it's clear that this measure, choosing this tax in particular, creates lots of incentives in the economy that are not ideal for growth as well, and investment and wages and employment. It's not a great tax to choose if you're going to raise any tax. I guess I would say just a little bit as well, that we do have to also remember that the fact that they have increased taxes and increased borrowing has led to more funding coming to Scotland too. So, and therefore some of the better but not good situations for local government, for example, are because that extra tax has been taken too. So we do have to remember that as well, that the 3.4 billion more than the previous baseline for 25-26 is partly because of the decision that the government have made to raise this tax. Is this the best tax they could have chosen? Probably not, given the other distortions it creates in the economy.
Thanks very much, Mary. Shelley, do you want to come in as well on this?
Sorry, lost microphone for a minute there. I think on the question about the impact of budgets on the sector, so we do sometimes contact different departments asking about if there was impact assessments. So as an example, I did contact the Treasury, and I asked if there was an impact assessment on the impact of the increase in national insurance contributions, what impact that would have on the sector. And eventually they did send me their impact assessment, but it was very brief and very vague. So yes, they do sometimes do impact assessments, but I was a bit surprised by the quality of that when I received that one as an example. But yeah, you can get in touch with them and ask what impact assessment they've done for various things, and they will be obligated to eventually send that on to you.
Thanks, Shelley. And Mirren, do you want to come in on local authority consideration, about awareness of the sector and the contribution it makes, and how it figures in budget setting?
Yeah, so it's one of the things that, obviously my role is at a national level, so I don't deal with sort of the specifics that you will locally, but it's certainly something that sort of the councillors that attend our board and leaders, they raise their concerns about the impact of budgets on partners kind of within all of the spaces we're in. The consideration that'll need to be done, and obviously there have been consultations that councils have run in the run up to budget. There are considerations about what decisions need to be taken, and those will all feature. I'm not sure that local authorities will necessarily do a separate impact assessment for the impact on sort of the third sector, but it's within the context of the services that they sort of deliver, and it will be pointed out where it's third sector delivery that leads to kind of that where the focus is. in some sectors that I'd say that there's a bit of a better understanding, sort of adult social care, the impact, or there is more discussion about the potential impact on kind of the providers of some of the issues and changes, whether or not some of the challenges are then actually reflected in the reality of the policy or funding that comes forward can be another issue. So.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone, for those answers. I'm going to draw on a question that's come in from Juliana Amaral from Borders Community Action. She's talking about how the voluntary sector is often forgotten when key decisions about budget are made. A frustration I think that a lot of us on this call will share. She says, by default, when public services are cut, it is the third sector that suffers the impact of services reducing or ceasing to exist completely. What are the plans for national and local government to involve the third sector as early as possible in conversations and decision making? Just to knock on from that. So, Mirren, I'll bring you in, and Shelley and Mary, if you want to come in about how that's in fact a good idea. That would be appreciated as well. But Mirren, what are the plans local government have to involve the voluntary sector as early as possible in conversations about budget setting, decision making? And I know you've touched on this a wee bit already, but maybe if you can elaborate. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to each individual local authority and the approach that they sort of take within that. But as said, there are obviously public consultations and the opportunity to contribute in that. In terms of discussions then of how budgets are utilised and used, that it'll be with sort of the local areas and also the service users within the context of any cuts or savings that kind of need to be made. The timing of those sometimes, and I know this isn't an ideal answer, but probably can be tricky ones to have at times because of when decisions need to be made, with the timing sort of all of it. In terms of like how things are considered at a national level or brought in, there are, again, kind of would say there are some spaces that are better at involving third and other commission services kind of in the design and development of policy and therefore kind of funding than others. We certainly always consider as part of any policy that's sort of brought forward is how would it be delivered at a local level, and that would feature into what COSLA and local government's response to any sort of proposals would be, because if it's who's delivering it, how is it delivered, what are the expectations, all of that needs to be considered, and that needs to have conversations where it's not expected that it would be local government being the direct sort of front line. If it would be commissioned, then that would obviously then need to involve sort of wider partners to ensure that it is in fact possible to do whatever is being done. It's not perfect, and it is kind of a challenging space, and there can be a lot happening in areas, and we're not always, you're not always aware of an idea that might have been in development until it comes along quite fully formed at times. So yeah, but we do consider it.
Okay, thanks, Mirren. I don't know if Shelley or Mary want to come in on that. I know you've talked about that already.
I'd maybe just say that there are a lot of opportunities to engage in the lead up to the Scottish budget. So, for example, there's the programme for government, there's committee pre-budget scrutiny over the summer, and there's opportunities to brief and things before the budget. So through all these things, there are opportunities to present ideas, but all of these things require resource from the sector. So they require people to be available to do that work. Often, for example, when you think of committee pre-budget scrutiny, it all takes place at the same time. over the summer when a lot of people are on holiday, and when if you want to reply to multiple committees on pre-budget scrutiny, the voluntary sector just aren't going to have the resource to do that. So often the sector are left to, you know, pick which pre-budget scrutiny is most important to them and which committee they will engage with. The committees, I feel, are quite good at engaging with the sector. You will see some of the usual suspects engaging with committees, but again, that's down to resource, where the sector, you know, have that resource to engage. But I think ultimately, what it comes down to is you can engage as much as you wish, but if you don't actually value the contribution of the sector, then those engagements aren't going to make their way through the budget. And we have had a lot of positive rhetoric, but even when you look at the budget document, which I have and others here have, you know, for many years, the references to the sector are so few and so small compared to references to some other sectors. So it just doesn't feel like the sector is considered sort of a major player, and that's something that we all need to work together on, and hopefully our fair funding messaging, you know, is working towards that. And I think another thing that we need to consider as a sector, which again I hope our fair funding work does offer, is that we need to present solutions to some of the problems that these sorts of cuts and things cause, of how the sector can be supported. And again, I think that our fair funding work does offer some of those. So I think there are opportunities to engage, but not all organisations are going to have the capacity to do that. And ultimately, if the sector isn't valued in the way that it should be, then it's not going to be reflected in the budget. And just some thoughts there that people can respond to if they wish.
Thanks, Shelley. I don't know if Mary wants to come in there. If not, we can move on to another question. Okay, just a couple of sort of comments that have come in. We've got one from Martin and Cludham talking about the tendering process and renewal for April in this year. So far, 2 have responded requesting same level of service at a reduced price. The rest, we are waiting updates. And that's exactly our worry and why we're pressing so hard for contracts to be uprated. This still leaves multiple contracts with less than 3 before expiration with no information of users, for users, service users or employees. Got a comment from Barry Fisher as well. The increasing funding disparity between public and voluntary sector also means that we're beginning to lose talented colleagues to either councils or public bodies. I fear that the gap will only increase, thus weakening the sector over the medium and long term. Just on that, so the voluntary sector does so much, and that includes delivery of public services. That's why they receive grants and contracts to be able to do that, but they need to be, those grants and contracts need to be fit for purpose in terms of the amount. Now, the voluntary sector didn't have its problems to seek before the Chancellor's announcement, but a question for the panel can maybe kick off with Mary. If the employer national insurance increase was intended to provide more resource for public services across the UK and here in Scotland, is it not a very funny way of going about it? I think you've touched on this a wee bit already, but be keen to get your views on that. And by extension, what do you think maybe the impacts are for people and communities across Scotland, given the impact it will have on voluntary organisations?
So in terms of many commentators on the fiscal situation were saying taxes are going to have to go up in aggregate. The demand on public services, the ageing population, they need to invest in our public services to sort out the chronic underinvestment they've had for the last couple of decades. All mean that we're all going to have to pay more, probably. And that's before we even grasp the nettle of dealing properly with funding social care in the long term. Using this particular tax, which discourages payroll employment, and in the way that the threshold was lowered as well, likely to impact particularly on those who employ a lot of people on lower wages, and potentially would impact most on, people who are maybe part-time workers and all of these sorts of things. It does seem a strange one, particularly when successive governments, if you leave aside the kind of inequality issues I was just talking about, successive governments have tried to reduce the tax between self-employed and employed workers so that to not make off-payroll employment attractive and encourage people to be contractors when they're really not. So it does seem like a strange one to pick in terms of raising more funds, particularly because although there is more money flowing through to Scottish Government and therefore to services because they've raised tax, the offsetting cost of this is going to disproportionately impact on particular services and particular organisations. And, is that really the intention? Probably not. And I'm not sure how well it was thought through, to be honest, as with many budget measures that can happen sometimes. Just on the pay point quickly, this there's a few questions about this, both in the chat and in the Q&A, about the disparity between similar roles in the public sector and in the third sector. And I just wanted to come back on something that either Sharon or Mirren said about the public sector in Scotland being better paid, which it is, than the UK average. And the UK average includes London. That's quite something that, it's significant. The issue that the third sector has, that quite often people in the public sector doing similar roles have more secure contracts, have protections like no compulsory redundancies, and also will perhaps be better paid. And those are decisions the Scottish Government have made to try and pay their workers more. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing, but it has consequences for funding elsewhere in the budget in a fixed budget, which means there might be less money for services flowing through to local government or for contracted out services, which in turn, given those public sector workers are paid more, might mean that third sector organisations are less able to do those things. And, from the Treasury's point of view, in terms of fully funding this employer next thing, they might say, well, why should we give you more money? Because you have chosen to increase your wages more than the UK average. So you can see from the UK Treasury's point of view, that's a decision within the control of the Scottish Government, and they have decided to pay workers more, which means that this employer next thing will cost more. And I think in the long run, this issue about the public sector pay is a big issue about the sustainability of the finances in Scotland, given it puts what it does, maybe however laudable it is a decision in the moment, is put pressure on other areas of the budget within a largely fixed budget. So it is sort of something to think about, both in terms of the disparity between those delivering services in the third sector and the public sector in similar roles, but also the pressure it then puts on the money flowing through to maybe local government and other services, because the money's got to come from somewhere in a largely fixed pot.
Just staying with you, Mary, and we at SCVO have done a bit of analysis about the impact of the employer national insurance increase on voluntary organisations here in Scotland and what it will cost them. We've asked Treasury for their own analysis. We've had a question from Barry Fisher. Has the UK government done any assessment of how many people will be made redundant by the ENIC decision, or by extension, just the impact generally of the ENIC decision that you're aware of?
No, not that I'm aware of. And I think it will be, I'm afraid, up to organisations like yourselves to get as much of that information as you can from members and to shout it as loud as you can to as many people as you can. And it will fall to you guys. And obviously, you'll have, my support in that. But yeah, it's going to be up to you guys and your representative organisations of the sector to put it in people's faces and make sure that, the impact on your sector is seen as impactful as possible. If you want them to move. I don't think there is going to be a move, but yeah, I haven't seen anything like that, because it's about the precarity, I suppose, of these sorts of organisations and the extent to which they're able to eat any of this once the funding's confirmed. And one of the issues, which hasn't been great in any of this, is why are we waiting until supplementary estimates for the funding to be confirmed? Why are we waiting for the Scottish Government to include the 1.3 billion for 24-25 in their baselines? Why? None of this is acceptable or necessary, and all of it would make the situation much more clear. Even if it was still pretty dire, at least we would be certain. And so from both governments, this is pretty rubbish. But there's no reason that the Treasury couldn't have confirmed the funding, which was going to sit alongside at the time of the budget or very soon after.
Thanks for teaming me up for talking about shouting about this issue to decision makers. So there are a number of opportunities for that. And one is the UK government's budget work we're doing, the Scottish government's budget work as well. If you're wanting to get involved in any of that, then please do get in touch with us at policy@scvo.scot. Eve will be able to put the contact details in the chat. Also, the Scottish Parliament elections next year, 2026, will be a huge issue for us to press some of these systemic issues that our sector continues to face without any justification at all. It's a scandal. And we will be pressing that case very hard with decision makers across the country. So we look forward to getting in touch with voluntary organisations about that work and how you can engage in that as well. Okay, doke, I think there's probably time for another question, which I think I'll put to Shelley first. It's from Jason Rose, and I think this will unfortunately speak to the experience of a lot of voluntary organisations and the sort of power imbalance that can exist between the sector and the Scottish Government or governments generally. In the culture sector, a lot of services are delivered by charitable alios who rely on funding from local government and are often seen as low priority despite delivering good outcomes for health, education, communities. How do we get alios into the budget conversation as they often feel they can't speak out? Will I bring in Shelley first and then Mary and Mirren as well? Bit of a funny one given it's alios.
Yeah, I think my answer will have to be quite short in that I'm not sure. That would have to be something I would go away and think about. But maybe someone else has some thoughts.
What about the experience of voluntary organisations that are just dispersing public funding, Shelley, that are maybe in budget conversations, or voluntary organisations generally that are maybe feel that they're unable to speak out? Because this isn't just an experience that sits with alios, but voluntary organisations as well.
Yeah, so you mean that when an organisation is maybe funded by government and they feel that because of that they are, worried about being seen to speak out. I think that, there's opportunities through work that SCVO do to share experiences anonymously. So for example, organisations that are involved in the third sector tracker, even we don't know within that work who has said what. That's completely anonymous, and we use those case studies within a lot of our work, just as an anonymous charity, or I think there's very vague information about the sort of organisation who might have made the comment. So that's one way that people can get involved if they feel uncomfortable to do so. But I also think that there are organisations, who do work closely with government and who are funded by government, who do still speak out, and I think that that's okay and good, and that the organisations should feel able to do that. I mean, if Scottish Government are to create an environment where organisations feel like they can't speak out because they're funded by Scottish Government, then that is a problem. And that's something that needs to be brought up with government. It's not okay for organisations to feel that way. So organisations should feel that they can speak out, and they should feel empowered to do that, because Scottish Government often call us well, I'll maybe forget the term now. No, it's not going to come to me. There's something friends. If anyone can remember it, then you can.
Critical friends.
Yes, thanks so much. And that is what we should. That is what we should be. We don't want to be, too close to government, and they should allow us the space to be that.
Can I just add on Alios, and Mirren might correct me, but I mean, when I was looking into this national insurance issue, in terms of trying to calculate how much it was going to cost different bits of the public sector, one thing I find quite difficult to quantify was the number, type, and employment that is in Alios. Now, I think the Scottish Government might be looking at this because at the moment they're not included in public sector employment status because they're seen as arm's length. But I think, in a technical definition, whether they're part of the public sector or not is a bit of a grey area, from a technical point of view, for the economic accounts. So, I mean, what I would like is for there to be much more information about how many of these organisations are they, what sort of services are they delivering, in which councils, and how many people do they employ? Because I don't know. And I think the estimates that I've seen are quite old. But Mirren, you tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right. We don't have sort of kind of complete and coherent information on that. We did actually a huge amount of work during the pandemic when we were trying to consider the loss of income and impact on all of that stuff, but haven't really picked up. It's something we're having a conversation about internally, kind of on how we do that. I would kind of say though that Alios are recognised as kind of a core either delivery partner for a lot of our services, or sometimes it depends on the Alio setup itself, the relationship and what it's doing. That does vary greatly in different areas, but we always from local government kind of consider Alios within part of the local government family, almost, as how we sort of consider it. Though in terms of counting and estimating and doing all of that, we don't necessarily have the detail that we need. But picking up something that Shelley sort of said earlier, around the pre-budget scrutiny evidence, similarly, it's my team that writes the evidence that we put into however many committees we decide we're able to address that summer, which isn't always all of them. But that's often one where we try and work in partnership where we can. So we've got some good examples of working with sort of culture and leisure, sort of on that to kind of reflect some of those bits. So I think that the short answer is that we do consider Alios in that broader sense, but we don't necessarily have the detail we need to have the detailed understanding kind of where they are and what they're doing and how important they are kind of within communities and delivering services.
Thanks very much, Mirren. I think that takes us to 1:15. I'll answer one question finally very quickly from Beth Landon. What impact do you think the increase in national insurance contributions will make on grants available from private funders? SEO would be pressing for those to be uprated because the cost of business for voluntary organisations is obviously set to increase. I'll stick my email address in the chat for anyone who wants to get more involved in our fair funding work or our work ahead of the Scottish Parliament elections. And as Mary's rallying cry for shouting louder, please do take me up on that. I want to thank all our people, our panelists today who contributed. We've been able to get amazing insight for the sector, and we're very, very grateful. Just to repeat, this session today has been recorded and we'll be making it available on SCVO's YouTube channel in the next few days, so do watch out for that and share it with your colleagues in the voluntary sector. And with that, I'll say thanks everyone for coming along, and a big thanks to our speakers today. And I'm sorry for detaining you for an extra minute. Thank you.
Thank you.